A key area of youth sociology has been the study of youth transitions. This treats the concept of youth as a transitional kind of liminal period between being a child and being an adult. In this time, young people do different things where they become more and more independent from their family. So we see kind of three kinds of traditions that are studied in depth. There's the school to work transition, as young people transit from studying in high schools through to maybe university or going out into the labour market. There's relationships transitions where people look for a partner and settle down. And there's domestic transitions where they leave the family household and try and find a place of their own to live. Much of the youth transitions research over the past couple of decades has shown that this transitional period has been extending, that ticking off those markers of adulthood, of getting your own place to live, getting a full-time job, and settling down and getting married and having kids, as happening later and later in people's lives. Again, there's moral panics about this, arguing that young people are too selfish to do this, or they're too busy travelling, or, you know, they're, as I said, eating too many avocados to buy a house. But really what this research shows here is this is the result of really profound changes in the economic and social structures of society. The labour market itself has been heavily casualised. There's a whole rise of what we now call youth jobs, where people are actually legislated at a certain age to earn less than adults. It's kind of almost legislated form of discrimination there. And also in things like as it gets harder and harder to become financially independent, many young people are quite sensibly putting these things off later on into their life as they actually become more responsible themselves. So we see this transition as being maybe once in the past kind of quite linear. You know, if you were born at a certain place at a certain time, there wasn't that many options from you, and you would maybe, you know, if you were a working class man in Cessnock, you would end up becoming a miner, and it was pretty straightforward. These days it's much more complex than that, and we see this kind of transitional period being extended and being a kind of zigzag, a kind of one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. A key sociological theorist in youth studies around youth transition has been the work of Ulrich Beck, who talks about how we now live in what he calls a risk society. He means this in a number of different ways, but firstly, as things like science and technology become more prevalent in our lives, rather than it creating more safety and security, Beck argues that it's actually created more uncertainty and more precarity. As we now understand that the kind of advances of society, things like, you know, the provision of electricity and stuff like that, and huge global economic exchanges have actually produced these kind of global risks such as climate change and genetically modified food and the like. For Beck, this means that we live in a more precarious, anxious existence, both on a kind of more global level, but also as individuals. We've gone through what Beck calls processes of individualisation, where in previous generations we could rely on our role where we were born into the world, we would largely take up that role. Beck argues today that through individualising processes, we have the kind of perception of having more freedom and more choice, but really we're trapped in the kind of paradox of choice, where more and more choice means more and more insecurity, more and more anxiety. We're kind of trapped in this kind of ironic situation where we're forced to choose to be who we want to be, but really that's a perception because those traditional structures still have a profound influence on who we can be and what we want to do. So in terms of youth transitions, young people today have much different expectations than their parents, and certainly completely different expectations than their grandparents. So throughout recent generations, this has fundamentally changed. Young people today expect to have a multitude of jobs, not just trying to get a job in the one company and end up kind of working your way up and retiring at 55 with the gold watch or whatever. Today, young people expect to have many more jobs, many more career changes, and to be studying and working and going back and forth between those things. Young people are also making decisions about relationships that are much more pragmatic than in the past, where they're putting off settling down to much later, making deals with each other to move, all these kind of negotiations that become important as the labour market becomes more precarious, people are forced to be more mobile. Young couples are having kids much later in life, and again, rather than the kind of moral panics about irresponsibility here, we can argue that this is an actual responsible decision as they make sure that they actually do have the financial responsibility to be able to take care of kids. So here we see a lot of moral panics, as I was saying, about kind of how young people are apparently being selfish, narcissistic and that kind of thing in their lives. But really the youth sociology shows that the changes in generations from the current youth to previous generations of their parents and their grandparents isn't about necessarily selfish choices. It's actually a reflection of profound social, cultural and economic changes.